'Twas early in the morning when we pushed out into the stream, and I, for the last time, walked out upon the deck to take a last fond, lingering look of home. I was leaving all that was near and dear to me for a wild goose chase overland to the shores of the great Pacific. John Hawkins Clark wrote these words nearly a century and a half ago as he set out up on the trail west. The Oregon Trail began in the small town of Independence, Missouri, near Kansas City, and stretched 2,000 miles across half a continent to Oregon City in the Willamette Valley just south of where Portland, Oregon is today. The road to Oregon passed through portions of the present-day states of Missouri and Kansas, Nebraska and Wyoming, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. Over 400,000 people followed portions of the Emigrant Road to find new lives in the West. Today's Oregon Trail is not so much a destination as it is a journey. On this trip, we'll follow the route of the pioneers, visit the sites as they exist today, and listen to the very words of those who traveled here so long ago. The people came from all over, most from what is now known as the Midwest. They converged on St. Louis and boarded steamboats for the perilous ride up the Big Muddy Missouri River. At Independence Landing and nearby Westport, they unloaded their wagons and gear, livestock and families, and headed up the hill into town. There, they stocked up on rifles and ammunition, tents and blankets. They bought flour, bacon, coffee, tea, rice, sugar, and beans. They also brought along things like tools and utensils, coffee grinders, ox shoes, school books, and soap. In short, everything they would need to build a new life. "Go west, young man," said Horace Greeley. "Go west." Some called it a manifest destiny. Others said the East was, quote, "too narrow a space for the enterprise of men born and bred there," end quote. Derived from a Native American word, Oregon was used to describe a fabled river, a water passage between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. Explorers Lewis and Clark were sent west by President Thomas Jefferson to try and find this northwest passage. Of course, they found no such river, only a land of wonder. Farmers soon heard tales of free land for the taking, where crops would grow just because you wanted them to, where life was blessed, where there were noble savages wanting to learn from the white man's book of medicine. They were ready to believe it was heaven, and they were willing to cross hell to get there. But could a wagon make the tortuous trip? Could we take our families? They wondered. In 1836, a missionary named Marcus Whitman blazed a trail with his wagon to start a mission near the Columbia River. He also brought along his new bride, Narcissa, who found the trip increasingly more difficult than Marcus did. You see, Narcissa was pregnant. Soon, explorer John C. Fremont set out to survey the trail for the government. Now there was a road map. By the time Oregon became a United States territory in 1848, there were thousands, leaving everything behind, bound for the Promised Land. The Oregon Trail started at the southwest corner of Courthouse Square in Independence, Missouri. You could say that the Oregon Trail was born of independence. The spirit which drove so many to head west was a powerful one. Not far from the start of the Oregon Trail, the National Frontier Trails Center offers an understanding of what drove people to head west. For myself, Madoram Crawford wrote, having nothing to lose, I had little thought but for the adventure and advantages of a new country. William Shaw wrote, my family of boys were getting to be men. Land was hard to get, and I thought by moving to a new country, my boys could shift for themselves. John Hawkins Clark saw crowds of people, he said, lured from many a happy home, marching to those beautiful shores whose golden sands have set the world on fire. Mountain men and pioneer mothers, backwoods barefoot boys and proper young ladies, all heard the call go west. They were people like 49er George Bonnewell, 9-year-old Jesse Applegate, young lady Sarah Raymond, and celebrated mountain man Jim Bridger, whose grave here in Independence faces the western mountains he loved so much. Courthouse Square marked the official start of the Oregon Trail in its earliest years. Here, wagons formed ranks down these streets, headed west. When the wagon trains crossed the Missouri line, they passed beyond the borders of the United States. Families gathered on the edge of the Great Prairie, formed companies, and found new friends. It was a time of nervous anticipation, of preparation and celebration. The annual Great Heartland Trails Festival along the trail here in Lenexa, Kansas, reminds people of those simpler times. To the sounds of hammered dulcimers, young pioneers now ride in covered wagons. On the trail, the type of draft animal used was an important choice. Horses and mules were prized for their speed, often more than twice that of oxen. On the other hand, oxen could gather grass when it was available, swallow it, then chew it again later. This steady supply of food gave them more stamina to haul heavy family wagons. Oxen can travel 15 to 20 miles per day, 2 to 3 miles per hour, slower than most people walk. Women found the pace relaxed. Children could keep up, while men pondered the meaning of utter exasperation. Now, on a hot day like today, do you suppose this steer is thinking of a nice, cool slice of watermelon? How would I know? Oh, just a hunch. A little one. Now, most people did not ride in the wagons. Wagons had no shock absorbers, and the animal's strength was needed to haul just the heavy cargo. Many people walked much of the full length of the Oregon Trail. Some even did it in their bare feet. Their window of opportunity was short. Wagons had to set out between early May and mid-June, when the grass on the prairie was tall enough to ensure feed for the animals. But if they waited too long, they risked being stranded on the road by early snows in the Blue Mountains of Oregon country. When we camped at night, observed John Bidwell, we usually drew the wagons and carts together in a hollow square and picketed our animals inside the corral. John Hawkins Clark had time to write in his journal, "Many and varied were the feelings I experienced on this, the first night of my pilgrimage in the wilderness I was about to encounter. Sleep at length came to rescue me from uneasy thoughts of home, wife, children, and friends." Breakfast on the prairie. "Fried bacon, eggs, fresh butter, and hot cornbread and biscuit," said one man. For the children, there was fresh milk. Whatever was left over would be put up on the wagon, and by lunch, the cream would be butter, churned by the motion of the wagon. Some even found fresh wild strawberries. Strawberries and fresh cream. Can't you just taste them? "Fine morning," George Bonnewell declared. All well started at 6 a.m. Part of the company that joined us left today. They did not like to get up so early. Here the Oregon Trail turned west across the prairie, away from the Santa Fe Trail. Someone scratched out a crude sign which read simply, "Road to Oregon." So simple a sign, one emigrant wrote, never before announced so long a journey. Not a single man in Francis Parkman's party knew the way. "We rode for an hour or two," he said, when a familiar cluster of buildings appeared on a little hill. Apparently, they were going in a circle. John B. Wyeth admitted, "We were entirely ignorant. To go we knew not whither, to encounter we knew not what." In Topeka, at what is now Ward Mead Park, emigrants had to cross the wide Kansas River. Ferries like this one in Idaho spanned many of the major river crossings. Toll here was $2 per wagon, a small fortune, and some chose to ford the river on their own. Thrashing livestock, strong currents, and shifting mud sands all took their costly toll as well, in lives. The Sabbath was a day of rest. One way to spend a Sunday afternoon would have been to spread out underneath an elm tree, bask in the warm sunshine, drink in a cup of cool spring water, and listen to the children playing. It was a mild, calm spring day, wrote Francis Parkman. As a nook of green grass offered a strong temptation, I dismounted and lay down there. All the trees and saplings were in flower, or budding into fresh leaf. Alcove Springs was the perfect place to spend a Sunday afternoon. One wagon train spent 5 days here. Edwin Bryant took time out to carve the words Alcove Spring into a rock near the water's edge. That carving is still here, if you know where to look. A co-leader of the party was a man named James Reed, whose mother-in-law, 70-year-old Sarah Keyes, died here. A monument now marks her passing. Another leader of the party was a man named George Donner. You know them all now, of course, as the Donner Reed, or simply the Donner Party, who would endure a tragic fate trying to cross the mountains into California. In the spring of 1849, cholera broke out among the immigrants camped here at Red Vermilion River Crossing. In 1 week, it is estimated at least 50 people died here, buried in unmarked graves along the banks of the river. Usually, immigrants died of accidents or carelessness. Men kept their rifles loaded against Indian attack or buffalo sightings, and frequently shot themselves or family members by accident. The trail was a dangerous place to be. Finally, the immigrants arrived at Fort Kearny. Here they could resupply. Seth Doty remembered, the train was estimated to be 700 miles long. All sorts of vehicles, he said, from a coach down to a wheelbarrow. Out on the prairie, it seemed to rain a lot. The clouds in this region, Francis Parkman said, are inflicted with an incontinence of water. Such incessant lightning, such stunning and continuous thunder I had never known before, Parkman continued. The thunder roared over the boundless waste of prairie with a peculiar and awful reverberation, he said. The lightning flashed all night, playing with its livid glare upon the neighboring trees, revealing the vast expanse of the plain, then leaving us shut in, as if by a palpable wall of darkness. Edwin Bryant heard the rain falling in torrents, he said, accompanied by peals of crashing thunder and flashes of lightning so brilliant as to illuminate the whole vault of the heavens. In the clearing storm, Francis Parkman observed, a bright streak of clear red sky appeared above the western verge of the prairie. The horizontal rays of the sun streamed through it and glittered in 1,000 prismatic colors. I never witnessed a storm scene so sublimely grand, wrote Sarah Raymond. Oh, for the pen of an artist, she wrote, that I might picture the majesty and grandeur of the coming of that storm. out early this morning, and our pathway now lies in the valley of the magnificent Platte River, wrote John Hawkins Clark. Picture to yourself a broad river, winding through green meadows covered with grass which grows to the water's edge. Beautiful little islands, setting like gems upon its bosom. On some bright morning, when the sun first spreads his golden rays over the same, and tell me, if you do not see Enchanted Land. One day, Old Man molded clay into human shapes. He said to the clay, "You must be people." They stood up, and Old Man told them his name was Napi. "What are we going to eat?" they asked. Napi made many clay shapes in the form of buffalo. He breathed on them, and they started to run. Napi said, "This is your land. Let no one else come into it." Today, wrote Maria Schroed, we killed a beef for supper. Or I should say, tried to. Pa and the boys shot at it about 50 times before they got it right. Yes, those Indians had better think twice before attacking this dangerous group. To be attacked and left stranded in the wilderness without means. This often terrified immigrants more than disease, accidents, drownings, or even buffalo stampedes. Buffaloes were plenty enough, wrote John B. Wyeth. We saw them in frightful droves, as far as the eye could reach, appearing at a distance as if the ground itself was moving like the sea. In the early 1800s, there were an estimated 50 million buffalo on the plains. It was not uncommon to see herds 10 miles wide or more. Riflemen boasted of killing 100 without moving from a single spot. One man was said to have killed over 3,000 buffalo in just 6 months. By the turn of the 20th century, barely a handful were left. Along the Platte River, there were trails of First Peoples and early explorers. Later came the Pony Express, Oregon, and California Gold Rush trails. In 1846, Mormon faithful also began heading west, toward the valley of the Great Salt Lake. They were seeking freedom from the religious persecution and mob violence they found in the East. The Mormon Trail joined all of the other trails along the Platte River to become known as the Great Platte River Road. At Ash Hollow, wagons had to descend a steep slope known as Windlass Hill, which George Bonwell described simply, "a frightful place." Enoch Conyers thought the word steep does not begin to describe the descent into the hollow. "Several times I felt sure the wagon would tip over," he said. At the bottom of the hill, emigrants found rest and relaxation at Ash Hollow Spring. Stephen Long called these plains the Great American Desert. Fantastic rock formations rise out of the dusty plains. Edwin Bryant said that Courthouse Rock so nearly resembled masonry, it looked like deserted ruins. "We left our names cut in the stone," wrote Sarah Raymond. "There were hundreds of names there, but I looked in vain for a familiar one. I wonder if anyone that we know will find ours. Guidebooks measured the miles as they approached Chimney Rock and other landmarks, and explained where to find the best campsites. One hunter found elk, antelope, deer, gray, and prairie wolves, he said, panthers, buffaloes, prairie dogs, cranes, wild geese, and ducks. Rabbits and grouse were easy to find. Hungry emigrants could make pinole and pemmican, a paste of dried meat, berries, and melted fat. Out on these treeless plains, they soon ran out of firewood. Buffalo chips, they said. That's right, buffalo chips. No, they're not served as a side order to buffalo wings. These are different. At first, no one wanted to touch the little stinkers. Women tried gathering them in their aprons without touching them. Soon, however, kids in one party could be seen carrying them on their heads. Despite what they were made out of, the chips burned hot and clean, and odorless, as long as there were no fresh ones in the pile. As the light began to fade, wagons would be circled and tents pitched. Evening settled over the prairie. A fire was made, a kettle put on, bread warmed in a Dutch oven, and meat turned on a spit. Cloth was spread on the ground and set with dishes taken from the wagon box. In camp, fiddles and banjos sang out of tune. Kids ran out over the prairie in the dusk, and stories would be told to little ones, too tired to keep their eyes open. Grown-ups and their children slept on feather beds and buffalo robes, in tents or wagons, or outside underneath the stars. It was a magical time. One diarist wrote in his journal, "We slept to dream of all that we loved and had left behind us." The native peoples called it the hill that is hard to go around. Others have called it Nebraska's Gibraltar. Scotts Bluff was eventually named for a man whose final wish was to be buried upon the heights which now bear his name. "I could die here," said another man, certain of being not far from heaven. One pioneer mother found heaven here as well. Her grave was marked by an iron wagon tire carved with her name, Rebecca Winters, aged 50 years. One frontier poet wrote, "The next we came to was Platte River. Great sights were there to see. There was Courthouse Block and Chimney Rock, and next, Fort Laramie." At one time, there were more than 50,000 immigrants a year passing through Fort Laramie. Today, however, things are a little quieter. Visitors can see buildings restored to various periods in the fort's history. The garrison was called both a rose in the wilderness and a very miserable apology for a fort. The post-trader store gave emigrants an opportunity to restock, recuperate, and repair themselves and their wagons. Once beyond Fort Laramie, there would be no turning back. Hundreds of emigrants carved their names here at Register Cliff, including 3 generations of the Unthank family. But names weren't the only carvings these travelers left behind. To climb over the ridge, wagons had to form a single line. Over the years, thousands of wagon wheels carved a groove nearly 5 feet deep. Today, you could literally walk in the footsteps of the emigrants, here at Guernsey Ruts. Ahead of them rose 10,000-foot Laramie Peak. They had finally reached the Rocky Mountains. The going was rough. Wagons broke down in the dry heat. Tempers flared. If there is anything to bring to the surface a man's bad traits, wrote Enoch Conyers, it is a trip across the continent with an ox team. Alva Unthank, who carved his name at Register Cliff only a few days earlier, died of cholera here in the barren wilderness. As many as 1 traveler in every 10 did not complete the journey. It is said there exists an average of 1 grave for every 80 yards of the entire length of the Oregon Trail. Accidents involving wagons were common. 9-year-old Jesse Applegate slid off the trunk, over the wagon's foregate, and fell between the oxen's heels. The front wheel ran over my back. I tried to escape the hind wheel, but it rolled over my legs. Jesse tried to hide the accident from his mother. But at dinner, he was in so much pain, he said, when I couldn't hold myself up, she rose to her feet. She cried and caught me in her arms. Another boy was not nearly so lucky. William T. Newby recorded the tragedy in his journal. July 18, a very bad road. Joel J. Henry's son Joel fell off the wagon tongue and both wheels run over him. July 19. Joel Hembry departed this life about 2 o'clock. July 20. We buried the youth and engraved his name on the headstone. Joel Hembry's grave is the oldest marked burial on the Oregon Trail. It stands near this marker on private land, near the beautiful Ayers Natural Bridge, where children play in the creek, shadowed by this massive rock arch, where weddings take place among the trees. Edwin Bryant recalled one particular wedding he attended with mixed emotions. He wrote, "After we left the bridal tent, in looking across the plain I could see, from the light of the torches and lanterns, the funeral procession, conveying the little boy to his last resting place in this desolate wilderness. Then, a man arrived from another encampment and informed me that the wife of one of the emigrants had just safely delivered of a son, and that there was, in consequence of this event, great rejoicing. A death and a funeral, he said. A wedding and a birth had occurred in this wilderness within a diameter of 2 miles, and within 2 hours' time. And tomorrow, the places where these events had taken place would be deserted and unmarked. At Bessemer Bend, the trail left the Platte behind and headed over a parched land toward the Sweetwater River. Families had been advised not to bring too much. When the tired oxen could no longer pull the crammed wagons, family heirlooms were left to ruin in the dust. At the Sweetwater River, little Jesse Applegate thought, "I'd have all the sweet water I could drink," he said. I ran to the edge. Resting on my hands, I gulped a large mouthful. He was in for a surprise. The water was quite ordinary and surely not sweet, he said. They had arrived at Independence Rock. This large granite mass was named by a group of fur traders who first stopped here on July 4th. If the emigrants made it here by then, they were making good time. At any rate, they enjoyed warm summer days nooning here, spreading picnic lunches on the grass next to the river. Even today, Independence Rock still serves as a rest stop. Youngsters of all ages clamber up the sleeping giant to the top to wonder at all the names carved over a century and a half ago. It has been called the Great Register of the Desert. Leaving a name here was like signing a hotel register. Emigrant families let their kids climb up the rock to explore and wouldn't see them again for hours. After traveling the trail together for a few months, this was a good thing. In the distance, emigrants could see the mountains of the Wind River Range. Here in these mountains, there is a river called the Popoja. In Sinks Canyon, the river disappears into a limestone cavern and flows underground for over 1/4 mile. The waters re-emerge at a place called the Rise. Later, we'll see this phenomenon again, only on a much more fantastic scale. The final push to the Continental Divide at South Pass, Wyoming, noted explorer John C. Fremont, was a gradual and regular ascent to the summit, about 7,000 feet above the sea. And the traveler suddenly finds himself on the waters which flow to the Pacific Ocean. There is a monument at the pass dedicated to the first pioneer women to cross the Oregon Trail. Narcissa Whitman, remember her? She was quite pregnant at this point. Today, we set foot in Oregon territory, wrote Theodore Talbot. The land of promise as yet only promises an increased supply of wormwood and sand. Just beyond South Pass, emigrants had a choice to make. They could save several days' journey by taking the Greenwood or Sublet cutoff. However, this meant a trek of over 50 miles without water. Andrew Childs warned, "You enter upon a dry region, and will find no water until you arrive at Green River." Wagons started across at 3 or 4 in the afternoon and traveled all night until they reached the river. At the river, George Bonnewell refused to pay $5 for the ferry. But the tide runs so strong, he said, it took the wagon box, me, and another man half-mile down the river. It is a very bad river to cross. "I believe I could count 5,000 wagons this evening in sight," wrote John Tully Kearns. "I do not know where all these people intend going to make fortunes. But I am going to Oregon myself, so I am. Go it while you're young," he said. "When old, you can't." Friday at noon, August 18. Sarah Raymond wrote in her diary, "I am on the summit of Bear River Mountain, in the border of a beautiful grove of pine and quaking asp, near a spring of the most delicious ice-cold water. This is emphatically one of the high and sacred spots of earth," she wrote in her journal. How wonderful are the works of nature! Everywhere something worthy of our highest admiration is presented to view. The terrific storm, the broad prairie, the majestic forest. Yet there are no places on earth which I have seen which have a tendency to inspire me with such tender feelings, such elevated, pure, holy thoughts as mountains. Please stay tuned for the second half. We'll visit the magic valley of 1,000 Springs and watch a wagon train cross the Snake River. We'll cruise down the Columbia aboard a steamship and visit the City of Roses as we continue our journey along the Emigrant Road. Pronghorn antelope. Just one of the strange new sights travelers encountered on their adventure west. Mountain man Jim Bridger came into this land seeking adventure. Some say he left his name carved on this rock near the Green River, but others question it, saying Jim Bridger did not know how to write. Whatever you choose to believe, it's hard to deny that Jim Bridger did indeed leave his mark upon this land. In 1843, he established a trading post to service the growing tide of immigrants on the Oregon Trail. Travelers could stock up on supplies at Fort Bridger, a recreation of which is now a Wyoming state park. from Fort Bridger, the Mormon Trail headed southwest on a route through the Wasatch Mountains, which John Hawkins Clark called the roughest and most unchristian-like road that man ever traveled. Arriving at the valley of the Great Salt Lake, Mormon leader Brigham Young pronounced, "This is the place." Thousands of Mormon immigrants joined him. They laid out their city, planted seeds, and raised temples. Back on the Oregon Trail, 9-year-old Jesse Applegate and his buddies were having a little fun. One boy put his hat over the top of a small geyser. The hat crown stretched a moment, then burst at the top, Jesse wrote. The spring was called Steamboat Spring. It puffed like a riverboat. Thirsty travelers added sugar or molasses to the mineral water. Some men, apparently thirsty for something else, indulged in the waters of one called Beer Spring. Now known as Hooper Spring, it does indeed have a lager taste. It even looks like beer. Well, boys, is it good? Nearby, hot mineral water bubbles up just a few feet from the town golf course. Players on this course have a unique obstacle. The Oregon Trail runs right here between the first, 8th, and 9th holes. A pretty unique hazard. And you thought your golf game was in a rut. After a tough round of golf, you too could go soak your buns at nearby lava hot springs. But with a temperature near 95 degrees, most people I found were cooling off in the refreshing waters of the creek. At Sheep Rock, the Bear River turns south and signals the start of Hudspeth's Cutoff. Most men heading for California turned off the Oregon Road here, drawn by the glittering promise of gold in them thar hills of California. Fort Hall was established in 1834 to trade with the native population. Near Fort Hall, the Shoshone-Bannock Reservation shares the spirit of the powwow once a year at an intertribal event featuring a craft fair, rodeo, and dance. Dancers compete in different styles and age groups, and are judged on their rhythm. The beauty and pageantry is easy to see, as is a pride in their history they share with those who come to see it. For a totally different cultural experience, let's run over to Sun Valley, Idaho, There's music and crafts here too. The symphony plays to an audience spread out on the lawn, where children run barefoot to the sounds of classical music. Open-air shopping provides an eclectic display of things to buy, with restaurants and hotels to pamper you and fill you with good food. On summer nights under the stars, the Sun Valley Lodge hosts world-class skating talent on an open-air rink. Olympic dreamers fill the same rink during the daytime hours. From ice rinks to ice caves, we travel now to a place called Craters of the Moon. Lava, spewed from cinder cones and volcanic vents, creates an eerie and beautiful scene. The climate here is so dry and hot that rivers flow down through the cracks and disappear into the bedrock below. Remember Sinks Canyon in the first half of the film, where the water disappeared underground, then reappeared in springs? Here, water seeps through porous volcanic rock for hundreds of miles. It takes years for the water to reach the Snake River, where it finally rushes out of the side of the gorge, cold and pure, at a place called Thousand Springs. Let's join the river tour and go in search of hidden springs. This boy said, "I know where we can find some springs," but it wasn't quite what I had in mind. John C. Fremont's logbook recorded a melancholy and strange-looking country, one of fracture, violence, and fire. Our boat arrives at the beautiful hidden blue spring. Here the water bubbles up as clear and as calm as liquid glass. Even these dogs can't resist a cool plunge. They like to go chase the marmots, she said. Let's go chase some wildlife of our own, shall we? Every August, the small town of Glenns Ferry, Idaho hosts a big party, and friends drive in from all over. They serve up a hot, hearty, if not healthy breakfast of pancakes, eggs, hash browns, and coffee. Then everybody moves on over to the banks of the Snake River to watch a very special event. In order to avoid a rough sandy trip along the south side of the Snake River, wagon trains came here to a place now known as Three Island Crossing. The islands allowed them to cross the river in stages. Glenns Ferry hosts an annual recreation of that crossing. Volunteers in their wagons provide a spectacle to audiences gathered on the shore. Even local Native Americans get into the act, just as they did then. Further on, the Oregon Road crossed over the Snake River once again and climbed the dry hills of Keeney Pass. In many places, today's Oregon Trail is marked by Carson-ite posts, noting the exact location of this National Historic Trail. Many places have interpretive panels to give today's travelers a feeling of what trail life was like. At Farewell Bend, the emigrants waved goodbye to the Snake River and began climbing their way up into the mountains of what is now eastern Oregon State. Beyond the bend, the Snake River enters Hell's Canyon, one of the deepest river canyons in America. The canyon offers fun opportunities for hiking and water sports. Jet boats offer the opportunity to get seriously wet. Fires caused by lightning and local populations gave this area of the trail its name, that of the Burnt River. The steepness of the canyons made travel difficult at best. Today, visitors can walk through the renowned Interpretive Center at Flagstaff Hill, Oregon. Ponder how to pack a wagon. Walk through life-sized historical displays. Or experience living history with shows about the pioneers. John Boardman wrote, "At our feet was a beautiful, fertile valley of great extent, and hundreds and thousands of Indian horses grazing in the distance." Not far from the trail, the Wallowa Valley is the homeland of the people of the Nez Perce, breeders of the Appaloosa horse. It was the Nez Perce people who had helped famous explorers Lewis and Clark on their journey to the Pacific Ocean. Near Wallowa Lake, a 15-minute tram ride climbs 8,000-foot Mount Howard. The tram, attached to a continuous cable nearly 4 miles in length, is billed as one of the steepest such rides in North America. Fragile alpine flowers and magnificent views greet visitors to the mountaintop. One could easily spend the better part of a day up here. John Tully Kearns. This is the best and most beautiful place we have seen on the whole road, or in fact, in our lives, and is said to be a fair specimen of Western Oregon. If so, our expectations will be more than filled. Most emigrants never saw the Wallowa Mountains close up, but what they did see, like this quiet creek at the base of the Blue Mountains, gave them hope after months of crossing the great American desert. As the wagons crossed the Blue Mountains, they walked under the tallest trees some of them had ever seen. The trees were so tall, Washington Gillum said, it took 3 looks to see the top. Interpretive panels now mark the trail among the trees here at Blue Mountain Crossing. Tree roots still show the scars of wagon wheels nearly 150 years later. In the summer, gracious volunteers in costume hold impromptu history lessons for young and old. Often, they bring collections of artifacts visitors can see and touch. Passing through these mountain gates before early fall snows gave travelers a sigh of relief. Marcus and Narcissa Whitman chose a place among the Cayuse Indians to settle and build their ministry. But in 1847, an emigrant wagon train brought a cargo of measles. The Cayuse natives had no natural immunity to the disease and soon began dying in large numbers. The Indians watched while emigrant children got well and native children were buried. Enraged by grief and fear, some of the Indians massacred Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and 11 others. The victims are buried in the great grave, in the shadow of a hill where Narcissa stood watching for her husband's return from his many trips. The Whitman Mission now stands as a monument to a tragic misunderstanding. In part due to the massacre, territorial status was granted to Oregon by Congress. After months of struggle, travelers were finally approaching the Columbia River, the highway of Lewis and Clark 40 years earlier. The Columbia, the grand river which flows to the Western Sea. The immigrants were getting excited. They were on the last leg of their journey. When their wagons reached the Dalles, they could go no further overland. The narrow gorge prevented the passage of wagons along the river. In the early years, there were no other options than to build a raft or hire passage. Hudson's Bay Company wanted $50 per wagon and $10 per person for passage to Fort Vancouver. The price was intended to discourage American settlers from invading British hunting grounds. Sam Barlow was outraged at the prices. He and Joel Palmer turned their wagon train south, determined to find a land route over Mount Hood. They built what is now known as the Barlow Road. Today, much of the Barlow Road has been left untouched by the Forest Service. Driving the road can be an adventure in four-wheel drive, or a challenge for hikers who want to walk with history. As I made my own way along this road, I couldn't help feeling the passage of all the people who had struggled step by step along this same ground. The forest is quiet now, though. Only wagons of a sport utility variety pass here now. The highways of the Columbia Corridor now serve cars and trucks, trains, ocean vessels, pleasure boats, barges, and even electrons, carrying power all over the western portion of the continent. But before the dams were built, the high rock walls of the gorge narrowed the mighty Columbia to a width of only 58 yards. Young Jesse Applegate and his family were in grave danger. The boat began swaying so much in the rough rapids, he said it felt like he was swinging from a vine. The boat ahead was carrying his brothers, Elijah and Warren, his cousin Edward, and 3 men. Suddenly, the boat was sucked under. We saw the men and boys struggling in the water, he said. Father and Uncle Jesse, seeing their children drowning, were seized with frenzy. The men dropped their oars to jump in, but Jesse's mother and Aunt Cynthia cried, "Men, don't quit the oars. If you do, we all will be lost." They pulled hard, narrowly avoided crashing into a rock. The current dashed with such fury, Jesse said, that the foam and froth was as white as milk. Jesse's brother Elijah and 2 of the men swam for their lives, but the others disappeared under the crushing waves. Jesse's father, Lindsay, was inconsolable. Just above the Cascade Mountains, he wrote, one of our boats was caught in one of those terrible whirlpools and upset. My son, 10 years old, my brother Jesse's son, Edward, same age, were lost. It was a painful scene beyond description. It had rained all day, wrote James Ofield, a cold rain mingled with snow, and we found there was not a dry thing about the wagon. So mother and 5 small children were soon chilling to death. There was not a human being near, only the chilling howl of a hungry wolf, echoing down the mountains as it looked for a feast. There was no one to see, no one to appeal to but God. As she turned her face toward the mountain heights, the snow and rain running down her face, and a look that haunts me still, she prayed as if talking to a friend. We saw the light of a fire reflecting on the forest trees, and looking around we saw a band of Indians who had just lighted a campfire across the creek. It being quite dark by now, Mother called to them, but it was some time before they understood. After several efforts, they landed a firebrand across the creek. We soon got a fire started, and Mother said, "Thank God, we will not freeze." Over roots and branches, fallen trees and logs, struggled Esther Bell Hannah. Over streams, through sloughs and marshes, uphill and down. In short, everything that could possibly make it intolerable, she wrote. Animals had an especially tough time. No grass would grow on thick forest floors. Open grassy meadows were a welcome, hungry sight for the stock. Today, hikers seek these same meadows, but for different reasons. A sternwheeler makes daily 2-hour cruises from Cascade Locks, giving a sense of life on the river. Their midday cruise tells stories and points out sights of the Oregon Trail, while another voyage talks of Lewis and Clark. Out here on the river, it's easy to imagine how the immigrants felt as they floated down the river on their rafts. This portion of the Columbia River has been brought to you by the wind. has been called the windsurfing capital of the world. Near Hood River, one could enjoy winter sports in the morning and water sports in the afternoon. His shoes having worn out, Joel Palmer climbed up the slopes of Mount Hood, nearly barefoot, to scout for a passageway through the mountains below him. Today, visitors could go up to the Palmer Snowfield, 1,000 feet above Timberline Lodge, to experience the very same views seen by Palmer. He would, however, probably suggest the use of socks, boots, and skis. Brr. Hiking trails now crisscross the slope that was described by some as the longest hill on the whole journey from the States to Oregon. Laurel Hill was so steep that wagons had to be lowered down by ropes, lashed to the trees. Scars from those ropes were said to be visible until very recent times. "The road on this hill is terrible," wrote Enoch Conyers. Men in his party chopped down a 40-foot tree and dragged it top end down behind the wagon. "This makes an excellent break," he said. From falling wagons to falling waters, Multnomah Falls is one of the highest in the United States. Visitors come up from Portland for the day to enjoy these falls. A leisurely drive along the Columbia will take you past Oneonta Gorge, Horsetail, Waukena, and La Tourelle Falls, among many others. Most of these cascades are right next to the old scenic highway. Many have hiking trails, begging for a closer look. Scenic Old Highway 30 bypasses the busy interstate for a spectacular view of the waterfalls and forests. Then up above the gorge to the views near Crown Point. Emerging from the mountains, the Philip Foster Farm was a vision of heaven and new home for Esther Bell Hannah. About 4 o'clock, we came in sight of houses and gardens, field and fences. Now, after having passed through the dangers, sickness, trial, and difficulty, we are safely landed on the Pacific shores, she wrote. Nearing the end of the long trail, Jesse Applegate was disappointed when he saw Cape Horn. Tired, hungry, and sleepy though I was, I expected to see a genuine horn sticking out of the river bank with a cape of some kind spread about it. This final blow added to the others of my trip. The Missouri line I never saw but knew we crossed. Ash Holler, where I noticed no ashes and heard no one holler. Chimney Rock, only a pointed rock on a hill. And the Sweetwater, tasting mostly brackish, not sweet. What a list of disappointments for a boy who had his mind set on all these marvelous sights, he said. Canadian-born John McLaughlin was the chief factor for Fort Vancouver when American settlers began arriving. Against British rules, McLaughlin not only supplied the emigrants with food, he extended them credit. This enabled settlers to borrow against next year's crops, to get their land cleared and seeds planted. Hudson's Bay Company eventually abandoned the fort, and by 1866 it was no more than ashes and rubble. Today, the fort is being rebuilt by the National Park Service. John McLaughlin later retired to Oregon City, built this home, and became an American citizen. John McLaughlin himself founded Oregon City and is remembered as the father of Oregon. We landed this morning at our destined place, Henry Allen wrote, and to our great joy found the rest of our company all safely over the Cascade Mountains. We remained here several days to rest and dry out and counsel where to buy our claims. Only about 65,000 of the pioneers who came west on the Emigrant Road settled in Oregon. The rest went off to California, Montana, the Great Salt Lake, Colorado, or points elsewhere. The Oregon Trail passed quietly into history with the arrival of transcontinental railroads after 1869. Here at last, Oregon City. The pioneers spread out along the rich valley of the Willamette near the falls, made it through the winter on the kindness of their new neighbors, and staked their claim to the American dream. William Overton borrowed a quarter from Asa Lovejoy to file their new land claim. Eventually, a town grew up, and another coin was tossed. Heads name it Boston, tails Portland. It ended up being 2 out of 3, and Portland was born, or so the story goes. Just 78 miles from the shores of the Great Pacific, the City of Roses resides where the Willamette River flows into the Columbia. Visitors here can find the Oregon History Center, the Washington Park Zoo, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, Pioneer Square, and the twin spires of the Portland Convention Center. There's art here, even ballet. A performance of Swan Lake, perhaps? Or not. And that monument to capitalism, the shopping mall, here at Lloyd Center. Or in this case, simply a monument to capitalism. There is, of course, much more to see and visit here. The grotto, the Pittock Mansion, and even the Church of Elvis. But this is, after all, the City of Roses. In the International Rose Test Garden are 500 blooming varieties of modern and historic roses. A verse by Dorothy F.B. Gurney on a plaque here in the Rose Garden reads, "In a garden, the kiss of the sun for pardon, the song of the birds for mirth. One is nearer God's heart in a garden than anywhere else on earth." While overjoyed at reaching the end of the trail, the emigrants must have been sad too. It was truly the trip of a lifetime for many. I know that for me, following in their footsteps 150 years later was truly a profound experience, and one I shall not soon forget. It was Talmadge Wood who said, "Just say for me to the young men of old Milton, don't live and die in sight of your father's house, but take a trip to Oregon." But if they should come to settle here, I would advise them to bring a wife along, he said, as ladies are very scarce. And if you should have any maiden ladies about, dying in despair, just fit up their teeth well and send them to Oregon. And finally, there are the words of Jesse Applegate, who later recalled, "Those who have gone on their last long journey lived to see the wilderness bloom. Railroad trains flash across the plains and mountains over which they toiled with their weary ox teams long ago. May their sleep be sweet in the bosom of the land they struggled so hard to gain and loved so well."